done here. So thank you. Okay, then item number 15.
Recommended two-year financial plan for fiscal years 2016 and 2017.
Hey, Mr. Casey.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and council members. We're here today, and Bob Samario, the acting assistant city administrator / finance director, will give you an overview of the proposed two-year financial plan. But I just want to do a brief introduction. You have the document in front of you. You got it today. We expected that you have read it thoroughly and are ready to take action on it. It really is kicking off a 2-month process for you to proceed reviewing the budget and making recommendations before adopting it in late June. And I just kind of wanted to tee up for you kind of the overarching theme this year for the budget. We talked a little bit about it at the budget work session we had back in February. Our finances are good. Revenue growth has been stronger than in the past, and so we're in much better shape than we've been before. But we have kind of 3 competing priorities that you'll see we've tried to balance with the proposed budget that you have in front of us. One is a need and a desire to restore some critical services or enhance some priorities that you have had as council in the operating budget. And so you'll see some positions are recommended to be added back into the budget. At the same time, council, a number of you at least, and I think staff agrees, wanted to keep a focus on trying to close the gap on our policy reserves. We have a policy reserve level that's a percentage of the operating budget. It's funded at about 90% of the policy level, and so it's much better than where it was 6-7 years ago, but it's not quite fully funded at the policy level. And as Mr. Samario will explain, you're kind of chasing a moving target. As your budget grows, those percentage requirements grow. And so you're always having to put more money into reserves to try to close that gap. And so we've proposed a budget. And then the third leg on the stool that we're trying to balance is increased funding for capital spending and infrastructure, and that's been a council priority for a number of years now. So those 3 items are kind of competing against each other, and you'll see in this budget that we've taken a relatively modest approach on the restoration of services and tried to reserve a chunk of money that would go towards the end of the fiscal year to help fund those policy reserves, and half goes to capital as per your policy. So it's a little different approach than we've had in the years past to try to keep some balance between those 3 priorities. So Mr. Samario will give you a more thorough overview. I want to appreciate all the finance staff, Mr. Samario's staff, as well as the budget liaisons. We've been working on this since December, and so it's a lot of work that goes into getting this document ready, and I appreciate all the staff throughout the organization that played a role in that.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Madam Mayor, council members, Bob Samario. So you have in front of you the 2-year financial plan for the next 2 years, 16 and 17, and of course it includes the recommended budget for next year. It is a big document, a lot of information, and we will, over the next 2 months or so, we will be presenting to you parts of it at a time. Each department will be before you to cover that. And then the Finance Committee also will look at some of the more detailed aspects of the numbers, the multi-year forecast reserves, and those kinds of things. So the outline today, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes on the layout and format of the budget document, just to kind of how's it organized and the like. We'll give you an overview of kind of what Mr. Casey indicated. We'll look at some financial highlights citywide and then focus primarily on the general fund in terms of highlights. And then we'll spend a little time on enterprise funds and then look at some of the key initiatives staff are working on, or at least are planned for next year. And then the proposed public review schedule, which is on the agenda for you to approve today. So just the key sections, there is this, what's called the City Administrator's budget message. This year is a little longer than at least in past years. It's about 26 pages or so. I think it's good information. It's a very broad description of what's going on and what were the sort of the factors that went into this year's budget development. Some of the summary schedules, before you get into the details, show the sources and uses of all the individual funds that are budgeted, including the general fund. And so it shows revenues and expenditures. And then a summary of revenues by fund, so there's some more detail on the revenues, and then more detail on the summary of appropriations by fund and program. You'll also see a schedule and authorized position, not only what the counts are this year, but what they were historically and how they've changed. Our proposed capital program, and it not only includes the next couple of years, but it also goes out more years to kind of more align with our CIP, the 6 years capital improvement plan that does look 6 years ahead. And then there is a section called Citywide Objectives and by Policy Area, which we deal with more citywide P3s, if you will, versus those that are more specific to a department or program. So this is a little bit of a, kind of a repeat of what Mr. Casey indicated, but the budget document does reflect a much more improved local economy, and even looking out for the next few years, we're pretty bullish on the next couple of years. The general fund tax revenues have been very strong, as you've been hearing every month. We report on bed tax and how strong they've been. The last 4 years, bed tax alone has grown by an average of 4% or 10% per year, which is pretty strong. As we will talk about later, some of that has to do with the great weather, but also vacation rentals, which the mayor alluded to, has accounted for a lot of that growth. Our general refund reserves as of last year, so June 30, 2004, when we closed the books, we're almost fully funded. We're about $1.9 million short of where we used to be. Contrast that to where we were about 5 or 6 years ago when we were about $10 million short of our requirements. I do want to point out that there have been some major hits recently. We'll talk about a couple lawsuits that are really impacting our reserves. They're one-time hits, but they are significant. And there is one ongoing impact that we'll talk about. So because of these issues or impacts, it is going to be a challenge to meet those reserve requirements. And just the fact, as Mr. Casey indicated, that our budget is growing, so because it's 25% of the budget, we're chasing that moving target. And then also, lastly, the modest increase of staffing and services, they total $780,000 and 8 full-time equivalent positions across many of the departments in the general fund. And then in terms of the enterprise funds, and we'll get into these in more detail, but historically, as you know, enterprise, we've always said they're doing great, not a problem. Where we've had issues, we're in the general fund. Things have kind of flipped. The general fund is doing well, but enterprise funds in a lot of cases are struggling financially, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Plus, you've heard a lot about some of those situations. So this is a summary of what we call our sources and uses of funds. This is for next year. And you can see it's organized by the fund we call fund type, our general fund. It shows the use of reserves that are planned next year. And in this case, we're planning on using $2.4 million in reserves, which sounds surprising. But if you recall the fact that a couple of years ago, the council adopted a new policy that said that half of our surpluses would go to capital. Well, that capital is sitting down in reserves, and it totals about $1,840,000. And so that's the use of reserves now to supplement our capital program.
Can we call it something else then? Because that's not what it is. It's capital. It's a capital allocation.
Right.
Because I think people see that we're using reserves, and we're not using reserves. This was specifically for capital. You know what I mean? It's just messaging.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
This is the one half of the surplus that we as a policy say we're going to use for capital. So we were holding it in reserves until it came to the budget. But it was always with the intent to use it for capital projects, not to keep in reserves, right?
That's correct. So just to give you more specific information, back in 2014, we had a surplus of about $3.6 million, and our new policy says that half of that will be allocated to augment our annual capital program. So that $1.8 million is now being programmed in this fiscal year 16 for capital. So it's part of the number down below where you see $3.2 million. Part of that is being funded by the surplus that we allocated for capital back in 2014. We're also using an additional $600,000 in monies we've accumulated by the Community Development Department. They have what's called a technology upgrade fee that they've charged with every permit or plan check. And they're using that now to upgrade what's called their Tidemark. It's their planning or permit tracking system. So they're using those reserves to upgrade that system now. Our special revenue funds, these account for revenues that are restricted either locally or by granting authority or by law. A good example is our Creeks Fund, where we have 2% of our TOT tax going toward funding creeks restoration and water quality improvement projects. That's a restricted revenue, so we count for that as a special revenue fund. Our enterprise funds, you know well about. It's all those funds that are really financed from fees and charges. There's no tax support being received, so the beneficiary of those services pays a direct fee for whether it be water, wastewater, or trash. And then we have funds we call internal service funds. Those are funds or activities that provide services to other parts of the organization. A good example of that is our motor pool. They centrally account for all the vehicles that are used citywide, and they charge for those services. In total, you can see what the numbers look like. This year, or actually next year, our total proposed budget toward the bottom is about almost $400 million. So it has grown over the last few years. kind of how it breaks down by governmental type, by fund type. You can see that the largest individual fund is the general fund. In fact, it's larger than any other group of funds. Behind that are the enterprise funds in totality, representing 41% of the total budget. And then behind that are the special revenue funds and then internal service funds. When you look at the capital, it's a much different story. Even though the enterprise funds in total make up 41% of the operating budget, they represent 88% of the capital program. And as you can imagine, they're so capital intensive with water mains and sewer mains and those kinds of things. They devote a lot of their money toward maintaining and improving their infrastructure. This is a look citywide at our full-time equivalent positions. So you could see the trends since 2009, where we're close to our peak. 1,088. We dropped down, as you know, over time as a result of the recession. Next year, we're proposing an increase of really a net of 7 positions from 1,018 to 125 or 1,025, and that's a citywide number again. Looking at the general fund, so again, the planned use of reserves accumulated for capital is $2.4 million. Operating revenues are $124 million next year, and you can see how it grows actually in 2017 by about $4 million. Our operating budget for next year, $122.2 million. And I wanted to point out the appropriated surplus. So this is really a surplus that we are now appropriating into the budget to make sure that it goes toward helping our reserves and our capital program. This is really a surplus that you might see that says it's just going to be a surplus falling to all reserves, but we want to appropriate it because that ensures that money will not be spent and then will be, again, allocated between capital and helping to build up our reserves. And this is a new approach, and that goes the same for the $908,000 we have next year in 2017. Both of those are the surpluses that we are appropriating into the budget, almost like our other appropriated reserves. And you can see our capital program of $3.2 million in 16. It drops down in 17 because we haven't factored in whatever surplus we're going to get this year in 15 that would augment that in 17. And as I mentioned before, the 2.4 includes the 1.8 that was accumulated from 2014, and then the $600,000 in community development reserves for their permit tracking system. So this is the revenues in the general fund by category. You can see the largest slice is taxes. This is not a surprise. This is very typical for a general fund in a city or a county. Interfund charges, those are the charges we actually impose on other funds, specifically enterprise funds for services that we provide out of the general fund, like finance, city attorney, even mayor and council's office. We charge for those services to the enterprise funds, and we recover those through interfund charges. Only 9% of our revenues come from fees and charges, so recreation classes, the fees we charge for those things, permits, planning fees, only 9% we get from those total. So really always been around that amount, but when we talk about being able to recover our costs, we only recover a small portion of those costs. So this year, it was something we always had what we've called this anticipated year-end variance. You might recall that it started about 7 or 8 years ago where we started budgeting what we expect in a surplus on the expenditure side and his revenue side. It's always been about $1.2 million, at least in the last 5 or so years because of the recession. And it's supposed to represent what savings we expect to generate on expenditures. We typically have vacancies in staff, and we have always generated some kind of savings. This year, we raised that from $1.2 million to $2 million. We did that because we looked at the last 5 years or so and how much money have we actually generated in savings from expenditures. It's been actually over $2 million. Before the recession, that number was closer to $2.5 million because at that time we were factoring in any revenue surpluses that we might generate in addition to expenditure savings. So we felt it was appropriate for us to be more accurate and more realistic about what that expenditure savings would be, and so we raised that to $2 million starting next year. This is our key tax revenues and assumptions. I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly. Our largest revenue in the general fund are property taxes. Last year, we generated $26.5 million. This year, we expect to receive $27.7 million, which is about a 4.2% growth. And you can see that in the next 2 years, we're expecting about a 4% growth. As you know, the real estate market right now, there isn't a lot of supply, so they're not turning over that much, but they have increased in value. We expect the 4% growth primarily because the county is still, as we know, fairly active in trying to recapture some of the reassessments downward on those properties during the recession, and so they are able to recapture that more quickly than what they otherwise could under the current requirements that they could only raise the 2% per year. So they're not limited by that CPI when it comes to recapturing any properties that were lowered in assessed value. Sales taxes, you could see that this year we're projecting about a 4.6% growth and pretty close to the same in the next 2 years. So we feel pretty good about the next couple of years. Longer term, I kind of worry about the impact on internet sales and what that's going to do to our sales tax base. But for now, we're expecting similar growth. And then you can see this year we're projecting a 10.6% growth in our bed tax relative to last year. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think a lot of that comes from the growth. In fact, I know vacation rentals, not just the great weather and the like, but it could be 3 or 4% that relates primarily to the vacation rentals that we've seen emerging over the last few years. In the next couple of years, we do expect about a 6% growth. You'll see in 17 a higher growth because there are some properties that were offline that they're going to be coming back online, and you'll see that in 17 it'll be the first time that they'll be online for the full year. So that's why you see a little bit of a differential between 16 and 17 in terms of our assumed growth.
Ms. Murillo has a question.
Well, Mr. Samario, I mean, a lot of people are concerned about vacation rentals, and they're taking housing off of our market, and so but I'm worried that we are counting on money coming from vacation rentals when I'd like to stop them, frankly. So what do you have to tell me about that?
So we are, as you know, we have a process now. We've been directed by council to start a process that's going to look at what do we do about vacation rentals. Do we allow them? Do we not allow them? To what extent do we allow them? We have not factored in any decisions on our projections for the next couple of years. In terms of, we don't expect to see many more coming online that are going to register with us. I think we've exhausted our efforts in trying to identify them. So we think that'll level off. But right now we are not factoring in any decision by council to, for example, eliminate them or ban them.
But Madam Mayor and Councilmember Murillo, that's one of the headwinds that we're looking at. I mean, we don't want to make any assumptions until council makes the policy decision. But when you do, that's going to be a substantial reduction in revenue to the bed tax that we're going to have to factor into our budget planning going forward. And I think it's another reason to be somewhat conservative.
Substantial being how much?
Oh, $800,000 per year.
Okay, but
possibly,
depending
upon what the ultimate outcome is from a policy level about how much activity you do or don't allow.
Okay, I'm sensitive because people are calling us hypocrites, that we're allowing something to happen it's not zoned for commercial, right, in the residential areas, and here we are, counting these pennies. And so, but I mean, I say that I think there should be a transition period and some amnesty as we move away from vacation rentals. But I'm just, I'm making a statement. Okay, thank you.
Just so, since the topic is here, the timeline, because it relates to the budget of where you see a potential vote. I mean, we need a 5-vote majority to get anything done, but assuming we can get something done, what's the timeline you're thinking of that coming to council?
Madam Mayor, I think we're trying to take a deliberative process on this. That's a lot of emotion involved, and a lot of people have a lot at stake, and so planning is starting the work on compiling the information. They've already held a couple of kind of quiet meetings with interest groups to talk about this. The first public meeting is in June, but I think realistically it's 6 to 9 months, and Mr. Buell would even say maybe a year before you come to a final resolution. And so I think we would be making any financial adjustments as part of next year's financial plan.
So by next year's financial plan, we would know what the financial impact of whatever decision we would make would be.
We would be in much better position to make an adjustment.
So the 10.6 is we're assuming that status quo is happening while we're working on the actual policy, and then that 5.9 and 6.7 may change depending on what that policy is.
And again, and just to kind of respond to that, I mean, I understand the policy dichotomy we've got. We've been talking about it for quite some time. Right now we're collecting the revenue, and so I think we should accurately show the revenue we're collecting, and when council makes that policy change, we're going to have to make that budget adjustment and plan for that accordingly.
Right. Okay. Mr. Hart?
Well, I totally understand that's exactly how you'd have to prepare the budget, but I do think that our job is to look ahead and say, if we're here talking about the need to do something about that, we are also talking about a reduction in revenue. And so we need to talk about that up here and what that means, and not just have that happen next year and say, oh, now it's a $1.6 million hit. So I think that is going to be part of this budget discussion, is to question that future revenue stream and then adjust spending to match what each of us individually, I think, thinks about that issue in a macro sense, not precisely coming to a conclusion, but thinking ahead.
And I would agree with that. That is a consideration. I think it's going to be a little while before you make that determination. And so this fiscal year, you'll weigh about how much you want to play. And we've taken a pretty conservative approach with a large appropriated reserve. That is kind of a cushion in that regard as well. If you do some sort of adjustment to your revenues that are pretty dramatic, you've got kind of a cushion built into this proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our utility users tax, you could see that we are projecting that we're actually going to be a little bit below flat, a little small decline this year. Next year, you'll see a little bit of a bump, 3.5% growth, and that's primarily because of one of the sectors, that's the prepaid wireless. We've seen a loss in our revenues with wireless cellular, and primarily because people are opting out of contracts and just buying prepaid cards in their own device. AB 1717 basically addressed that and established starting January a mechanism where the State Board of Equalization will start requiring collection by those who sell those prepaid wireless cards to start collecting our UUT. They're going to charge us an administrative fee for that, of course, but we do expect a little bump starting next year, and of course on an ongoing basis. And then lastly, franchise fees. You can see it sort of behaves like utility user tax. It kind of goes up with CPI. You'll see that in 16, however, a pretty significant drop. And this is kind of what I alluded to at the beginning. We were challenged with our 1% of our franchise fee on our electricity with Edison. We raised it from 1% to 2% back in 2001. It became effective in around 2005 or 6. It's about $700,000 a year we're collecting today that we lost the decision on appeal. It was considered to be a tax rather than a franchise fee, and therefore presumably was requiring a voter approval. We're not suggesting, or we are suggesting that we petition the Supreme Court to take a look at this because it is a precedent-setting case. But at this point, we have factored in the loss of $700,000 of revenue starting next year, and this does not factor any amounts that we would have to pay back from prior years starting in 2011. So a big hit to us of $700,000, but again, factored into these projections. On the expenditure side, as you know, more than half of our budget goes toward public safety, police, and fire. Police, the largest department at 32%. Looking at administration and council, it's at 15% of the overall expenditures. Parks and Recreation, 13%. Public Works, this is just the engineering division and the general fund. The rest of it is tremendously big. It represents almost $100 million citywide in terms of that department, but in the general fund, it's small. Community development at 9%. So this is a summary of the expenditures, including the service enhancements. As you can see that the baseline budget, when we started putting together the budget next year and projections, our baseline budget on the first column was about $123.5 million. You can see the enhancements we are proposing for next year totaling almost $780,000. And then you can also see the positions that are proposed by department. I'm not going to get into the details of these because the departments, when they present their respective budgets, they'll get into all this and describe those things. Looking at just the general fund positions, you can see that from 2009 we had a dramatic decrease as a result of recession. It took me a while to figure out why we went from 609 to 595, but that was because of the dissolution of the redevelopment agency in that year. So we eliminated a number of positions. But since then, we've grown incrementally, in my opinion, and starting next year, we are proposing an additional 8 positions, as I mentioned, in the general fund. This year, I wanted to point out that in the current fiscal year 15, Council did approve 2 additional positions. One was a plans examiner to address the additional workload in community development, and a police officer that was added during the year. And as you'll hear from the police department, we have actually transitioned that position starting next year to a proposed civilian manager position to man our 911 dispatch center. And they'll talk about more about that when they present their budget. This is a capital program. I'm not going to go into each item. I just wanted to point out that it's a pretty extensive program. This is a subtotal of $2.2 million, a partial list. And this is the final remaining items. A lot of these projects relate to Parks and Recreation, but there's a number of other items. But in total, $3.2 million that we're proposing next year for capital, which is, you think about where we were about 3 or 4 years ago, we're closer to $750,000 per year in our annual capital program. So we've done really well in the last couple of years, because, in large part because of the policy the council adopted to allocate half of our surplus to capital. So we're going to look at multi-year forecasts. This is a really summarized version of our multi-year forecast that we kind of work with internally. You could see that our total revenues all the way out to 2018, so 1 year beyond the 2-year financial plan, they're growing pretty substantially. They're averaging 3.5% per year. And keep in mind that this doesn't just include taxes, but these are other revenues that we have no control over. These are fees. And so in the aggregate, a 3.5% growth is actually pretty strong. And when we look at historically, when we've had good times, good economic conditions, that's been pretty consistent. On the expenditure side, they are growing at a little bit of a faster pace, 4.3%. A lot of that is driven because of retirement costs, as you know, and other costs. I mentioned the surplus in the next couple of years. I show it here as a surplus, but it's really part of our appropriated expenditures for the next 2 years. And this is what we're proposing that's going to, we estimate it's going to be adding to our reserves, the policy reserves, whereas the line just before that is the 50% that would go toward capital. What this means in terms of our reserve balances, you can see that that same number I just showed you, this is the same number, the addition of reserves. In this year, 15, you can see that we started the year at $26.7 million, almost $26.8. We're proposing or expecting to add 1.5. That's half of the projected surplus this year to get to 28.3. Our required reserves based on the budget for 16, 25% of the operating budget, is $30.4 million. So we expect by the end of this year to be about $2.1 million short. So you could see, this is just to show you that the ending balance in each year, it becomes the beginning balance of the following year. But really, the required reserves are what we're trying to chase. It's a growing number. It goes from $30.4 million this year to $33.3 million in 2018. That's about $1 million per year because it reflects about a $4 million per year growth in our budget. So it's 25%. So it's really a function of the growth in our budget. And that's what makes it difficult for us to really get to closing that gap, because while we're adding surpluses every year, even to capital, the required reserves are growing a little faster than we're able to generate in surpluses. So as a result, what we're projecting over the next 3 years or so is that our reserve balances, or the gap, I should say, is going to get a little bit wider. Now, keep in mind that we still think that at the end of each year, we're going to generate some surpluses like we do. You know, we currently have a $1.2 million anticipated year in variance. We're raising that a little bit. But I think that unless we have some major turn in the economy, we're still going to generate some kind of surpluses that's going to further add to capital and further add to these reserves. So I think this is kind of a conservative approach to where we think our reserves will be in the next few years. But I think it's still fair to say that we're going to be challenged to close that gap fully, at least in the next couple of years. Now, keep in mind that I kind of alluded to this as well. This year, we will have paid out about $1.7 million in basically settled lawsuits, $1 million for a couple of cases, $1 million in one case related to inverse condemnation, and then the $700,000 we just had to pay on the district election settlement. That's going to be about $677,000. So these reserves here, you can see they're a little wider. The gap is a little wider because it reflects the impact of that $1.7 million hit. And really, it's hitting these reserves by one half. The other half is hitting what we would have allocated to capital. Enterprise funds, I mentioned earlier on that that's almost entirely funded from user fees, so no tax support. We have 7 enterprise funds, and I'll go through these quickly. The water fund, as you've heard, this spring 2015 marks the four driest consecutive years on record in Santa Barbara. Their supply plan, purchase water via the state water system. The Lake Achuma Reserve, we have some prior year. We are increasing our water production through rehabs to our wells, and also conservation. We are currently at 23%. We're projecting now for 25% next year. But it does appear that we're going to be moving forward with a desal plant, and that will provide initially about 3,125 feet of water per year initially. But it is having a significant financial impact. I know Josh talked about this recently, last week, but we're having to purchase water, rehab the wells, and then conservation, of course, causes revenues to go down because sales go down while our costs are fixed. And, of course, the cost to build and operate the desal plant. So rates have been approved by council. They'll become effective in July to offset these financial impacts. At this point, we feel like we need about more than 30% in revenues to offset those impacts. I know that staff will be back in early June with a potential contract for the desal plant, but also to talk about what they might want to do in terms of the rates, because, as you know, the adopted rates at the highest that they might be, and there might be some cushion there, but we'll see.
I guess maybe to Mr. Kalan, and maybe you need to get to us sooner, but there was a recent ruling related to tiered water rates, and I guess we're going to need to know how that ruling affects what we've been doing. There might be some variations there, but I imagine that it might affect our budget process, or I don't know if it affects us this year or not.
Madam Mayor, just quickly, I think we guessed right on the manner in which we constructed our rates, meaning they are cost-based. There may be some tweaks that we need to look at, but I'm not anticipating anything major.
That's good. Thank you. Good.
In the wastewater fund, per staff, the major focus is going to continue to be the renewal of capital facilities. They have a very old Elistero treatment plant. So over the last few years, they've been borrowing money to make some significant improvements. They recently secured a $20 million loan from the state. It's a low-interest loan comparable to what we're trying to get from the state for this desal plant. And they're working on another loan of $29 million for additional improvements. So they are going to be, they're stacking up in terms of debt, which means debt service, which means they're going to have to find a way to cover those. They do have a long-term financial plan that kind of contemplated these loans and the associated debt service for rate purposes. So they're expecting over the next several years that they are going to be looking at 5 to 6% increases to rates. Again, that was talked about in the past in terms of the long-term planning. They do plan to have about $2.1 million budgeted next year for pipe replacements. Part of that is pursuant to the settlement agreement with Channel Keeper, as you know. The Downtown Parking Fund is one of the funds that is doing really well. Their revenues this year are up about $400,000 relative to budget. They've seen an increase of 90,000 transactions since last year. For a number of reasons. And what's good is that most of the money does come from the hourly parking, so that's where they're doing well. They have strong reserves. They're almost at 100% of policy, so they are essentially double what they would need. And, of course, a lot of that is going to be for capital improvements. Focus on capital next year, $1.3 million for a number of projects. You can see the routine maintenance, but in addition to that, they're going to be replacing all the surface parking lots with more efficient LEDs, which will save money long term. They're going to expand the security cameras that they've installed in some of the lots and to the other surface lots and garages. And then they will be installing more electric vehicle charging stations. In the waterfront, another fund that's doing well. We've talked about this before. Basically across the board because of the great weather and the like, things are going well there. The cruise ships are done well. They're generating about $250,000 in net revenue. There are costs associated with having cruise ships come on board, but on a net basis, it does generate a fair amount of money. They're expecting about between 25 and 30 the next year, comparable to what they have this year. The Marina One project is almost complete, phase 5. All phases 6 through 8 are complete. And the good news is they've secured financing from the department, or actually the Division of Boating and Waterways, for the full $14 million. Airport Fund, don't need to get into that. We've talked about this with Council last week. Council directed us to go to the Finance Committee. It is scheduled for next Tuesday to get into more details of the finances. And then we'll be back to Council based on your direction to talk more about sort of the safety considerations relative to reducing our services by a third. The Golf Fund, similarly, we've had a lot of discussion on this. As you know, on the 24th of February, Council directed staff or authorized staff to contract the maintenance services for the course. So the staff is working with the committee made up of the Golf Advisory Committee and Parks and Rec Commission, and they're going to be evaluating options, and they should be back in July with some recommendations on how they move forward with an RFP. Solid Waste Fund, it's been fairly stable. You might recall a few years ago we negotiated a contract with Marburg, a franchise agreement. Since then, things are stable or have been stable. As you know, we are contractually obligated to pay increase the compensation to Marburg by 70% of the CPI. Fortunately, it's been very low. The CPI has been very low in the last few years. We're still working on adding restaurants to our food scrap collection program, and that gets composted up in the Santa Maria area. And then, as you know, we are working. Our major focus has been on the resource recovery project. That's this proposed MRF, or dirty MRF, and an anaerobic digester to deal with the organics. It's been seemingly an ever-ending project. I think we're in the 5th year. We're currently in negotiations with the vendor, and we'll be reporting back to the city administrator and city managers across the various agencies that are participating. And I imagine soon after that, we'll have to come back to council with some proposed decisions on how we move forward with this. Some key projects and initiatives, things that you know, but just for the benefit of the public. District elections, as you know, the city was sued last year for alleged racially polarized voting. We did settle the lawsuit, and we did agree to move forward with district elections starting this November. Primarily, we wanted to avoid large attorney fees. The city did, on a short notice basis or short-term basis, we held public meetings, and we also created a website tool for the public to suggest district boundaries, which they did. And on the March 30th, council approved the final map, and the court more recently approved the map. So we are moving forward with that. And part of that was paying the attorney of the plaintiffs $677,000 in attorney fees. Infrastructure financing, we have an estimated gap of about $400 million over the next 20 years. So that works out to be nice and neat, $20 million per year. These are just rough estimates, of course. The city held a number of public meetings with the committee to hear from the community, and council recently directed staff to conduct a more scientific survey of the community to gauge their interest on potentially putting a tax measure or some kind of a measure that would raise revenue for infrastructure. The goal, at least at this point, would be to generate about half of that gap, so something that would generate about $10 million a year relative to the $20 million of the gap. And we expect that in late May that the results of that survey would be presented to the full council. Vacation rentals, so we've talked about this. And I will say this has been in the last 3 years alone, this has emerged as really the key issue. When we started looking at this a few years ago, we had no idea it would grow to the extent it has. We were collecting maybe $100,000 a year, and now we're collecting, as Mr. Casey said, about $800,000 per year. But as you know, they're not allowed in the neighborhoods, most neighborhoods, and they have been enforced on a complaint basis. And we have been, as Mr. Casey said, we've been upfront. We've been fairly aggressive in enforcing the TOT and the business license tax ordinances. And so we are now looking at this and seeing what we do with this. The first question will be, what do we allow? Do we allow any of it, none of it? And then we can talk about enforcement measures. The zoning ordinance update, this is a 3-year project. It actually started last year. It's funded through next year. It's just to address some conflicts in the zoning ordinance and the fact that it was adopted so long ago. It's gone through so many iterations and changes. It just needs a comprehensive update. And then addressing aggressive panhandling and other inappropriate behavior on State Street. So you may recall this year, we included $150,000 in the budget to hire 6 community service officers, CSOs, to address some of these issues. It's been a challenge getting these positions filled. We currently have 5 of those positions filled, but because we have not spent nearly all that money, we are going to be carrying that money forward to next year, and we expect that by the middle of next year or sometime next year, the money will run out, and we'll be back to council to give you hopefully the results of that program. Have this been working? Has it not been working? And there's a desire to provide ongoing funding for that program, but essentially it's a one-time money, and it's not factored into next year's budget other than the fact that we're going to carry whatever we have this year into next year. As you know, the council approved an ordinance that gave citation authority to CSO, so that's going to be a good, add some meat to what they do. And just today, we approved the ordinances related to the aggressive panhandling and other inappropriate behaviors. So on a combined basis, these CSOs will have some pretty good authority to enforce these ordinances. And I think this is last but not least, the guide to small and new businesses. The idea is to make it easier for businesses, particularly small businesses and new businesses, to do business with the city. So we've provided online tools, brochures, and other materials and information to help these folks to things they should know when they start a business or expand a business. And, for example, what are the business license requirements? What city approvals are required? And down the road, because this is a series that we're working on, how to green your business. So this is a good effort led by Nina Johnson. So lastly, our department presentations. You can see we have 6 hearings. This is where the departments will be presenting their respective budgets to the council and the public. And then on June 1st, the council will hear the Finance Committee's recommendations. We'll have a separate concurrent process. We'll have council go through deliberations and provide some final directions to staff. And then we'll really close at that point all the public hearing process. And then we've allowed one more day on June 3rd for council budget deliberations if needed. And then on Monday, June 8th, another date if needed for deliberation. On the 16th, we'll have a Prop 218 hearing on our water rate increases. And then on June 23rd, we expect to then adopt the budget. I do want to point out that we do have copies of our budget on a CD-ROM. In fact, it should be included in your binder and the sleeve. We make it available to anybody who wants to come in because we don't like to have to produce a big document. We also do provide a copy at the main and east side branches of the library. It's on our website, and for the first time, we will have it by the end of the week available on OpenGov. So we're going to post that to OpenGov so folks can use the same tools they can for other information to access the information that's in that budget document. Lastly, I do want to thank, really, first of all, the department staff across the city. A lot of work goes into this, and Mr. Casey said December, but it does really start kind of in October. It's more like a 9-month process. A lot of people are involved. From the CAO staff, K1 is a big help with the 3 P3s and all that. But I want to particularly just thank the finance budget staff, particularly Michael Pease. He's our budget manager. He's the guy that quarterbacks the process, and he works a lot along with Jonathan Abad, the finance analyst. It's amazing what those 2 individuals get done. Julie Nemes, our accounting manager, and now our treasury manager, always also big help. Diego Martin, and Jennifer Disney. Just want to recognize them all for all the support and help to get this document in front of you today. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. The Prop 218 here, we already adopted water rates. So you mean the wastewater and solid waste Prop 218?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Because that part we're not doing that again. We did it. Okay. Mr. Rouse, and then we have a public comment speaker slip.
I did have a question about some FTEs, but really what I really want to do is acknowledge staff for finally a very readable slide presentation as well as readable. I can read both of them for the first time in memory, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
And for your speed reading also.
Yeah, really amazing.
Mr. Shankman?
I read this from my iPhone 6 Plus, and I recited the first part of this to the Planning Commission, so I'll just do this real quick. Neither Marshall, Waller, Wiley, or Collar, Armstrong or Lopez, or even Browning Allen wrench lack of diction in legal statutory exclusions that provide collecting from the handicapped and elderly. All you can do is put cologne on that, Casey. The point of government is to provide public health, disaster relief, and criminal justice support, allowing free enterprise to navigate aesthetic preferences to hospitality and recreation. Handicap access must meet equal or more than existing services currently provided, protected from electric car, bike lane, or valet criteria. Given the legal theory involved, does a fee schedule broadcast to the public denote free speech or libel, if not coercion method to function economy? The enterprise fund is reported to generate about $7 million per year with the Downtown Parking Committee, yet valued at $350 million total. How long would it take to meet $350 million with overhead at $7 million per annum? Depleting reserves while augmenting the perception of surplus collected by handicap as well as the employee park and ride fee increase against payroll suggests that itself to instead be a money pit and liability. And this program should be released to the private sector that may not have to comply to the ADA provision requirements for municipal facilities. Is there any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. It's back to the council and Mr. Hart.
Well, I think this is a tremendous effort, and this is a great start to the discussion, but I do think that your analogy of the three-legged stool is a perfect way to describe this. And to me, I think the first priority needs to be reestablishing our reserves at policy. And I know this is a challenge, and that requires not doing something else. And so, I think we're going to have to look really carefully at the service enhancements and at the capital investment. I don't think there's enough in either other pot to get to the reserve requirements. And if I want to be consistent with that, then I'm going to have to be consistent with that. So I said that previously, and I think that is the tough choice ahead of us. Now, there may be, maybe it's not either a total one or the other in the sense of all the service enhancements. We need to look at that very precisely. But I think there's a hard choice coming. The legal settlement hits are a big deal, and that completely changes the trajectory of this. And I think, to be honest and wide open, this vacation rental revenue stream is something that we shouldn't be building a base of expenditures upon, because that's going to be a problem in the future. So that's my comment generally overall on the direction that I'm going to be advocating for in this budget process.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I want to certainly put in my thanks to the budget team for bringing this together. It is an enormous task, and also the results, I think, are good ones that I think we can be proud of where we stand these few years after the crash. My area of primary concern is also the reserves. I have a different take, and so I'm going to ask staff to be bringing back to us a couple of slightly longer-term charts as we process this over the next couple of months. And that is to start at the bottom, which is somewhere in 2009 when we hit the 1/10 of at least our rainy day reserves. And then we've been working our way up ever since. And what I'm looking for is a chart that shows how we've made progress, both in terms of percent of policy reserves, as well as how many dollars short. And I see us as incrementally getting better and better. And at least for the moment, and I've discussed this briefly with Mr. Samario at one point, what I hope to be an idea that will interest my colleagues, which is to take the interest from those rainy day, from all reserves, and make that, besides this, the overage, make those two sources of income the foundation of going forward long term to supply those reserves. And it might not get us quite as to the promised land quite as soon, but if we're steadily making progress year by year, that's kind of at least my hope for approach, so that we do have perhaps a bit more money available for capital purposes going forward. So again, if we have those 2, 5, 6, 7 year charts to look at while we're having this conversation, I think it might be helpful as we look at it. Thank you.
Any other comments at this point? Okay, we do need a motion. This is to receive the plan and to approve the proposed schedule.
So moved. Second. So moved.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay,